As humans, it's in our nature to ask big questions. And as a meaning-seeking species, maybe the biggest question that we could ask is this one. Who are we and where do we come from? Well, today we'll consider how people have answered this question over the past 3,000 years or so. First, we'll look at pre-scientific and non-scientific ideas, but then we'll see how the emergence of science, including anthropology, completely changed the way that we understand ourselves and our origins. Now, long before the emergence of science, humanity had woven a rich tapestry of colorful stories and folktales to give us meaning and order to the world that we live in. And as a result, when we start to think about who we are and where we come from, there's no shortage of answers, but we're going to start with a trip to the Channel Islands just off the coast of Santa Barbara, where we'll take our big question, who are we and where do we come from, to the ancestors of the Chumash Nation. Before the age of microscopes and Bunsen burners, the ancestors, they gave us answers, and those were answers with certainty. But you know what? They didn't really concern themselves with empirical proof. In this case, they'd tell us that a female deity named Hutash, well, she planted seeds on Santa Cruz Island. And those seeds, well, they grew into the first people. And spectacularly, Hutash, she created a rainbow bridge for people to cross over the Pacific into mainland California. And those who made it over, well, they're the ancestors of contemporary Chumash people. But those who fell into the ocean, they became dolphins. And you know what? That might explain why dolphins like to swim alongside boats. We're long-lost cousins. Anyway, imagine you were born to a Chumash family. It was 1,000 years ago. You're a brilliant hook and harpoon maker for fishing. You live in a beautiful coastal settlement, and undoubtedly, you'd be a major fan of this Hutash, right? But despite your certainty about her role in your origins, you're going to be hard-pressed to find archaeological evidence of that rainbow bridge. Of migration, yeah, but a bridge and people seed, not going to happen. But you know what? That's okay. If you're still in character, you have certainty. You do not need proof. You do not need archaeological evidence. You see, certainty, that requires faith, not evidence. You have faith, and that faith helps you understand the world and your place in it. So, whether you're a Chumash elder living over 1,000 years ago, or maybe you're a 21st century substitute teacher from Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, all humans seek answers to some of the same questions, big and small, every day. And you know what? If we don't get them, if we don't understand what's going on, well, we tend to, and pardon my technical term here, we freak out. And the bigger the question, the bigger the potential freak out. You know what? Just think of a young child, right? That'll be our metaphor for humanity's age-old quest to understand the overwhelming mystery of our origins. So zap, lightning shoots across the sky. Then thunder booms, right? Sending that child right under the table in fright. Now that's scary, scary stuff for a kid who's, well, having a hard enough time trying to figure out how to walk and talk. That kid just doesn't have the mental apparatus to understand why electricity is ripping through the air, right? So how are we going to calm him down? What are we going to say to calm his young, shaken nerves? If you're like my parents, you're going to use the bowling thing, right? Don't be afraid, Jimmy. That's just your grandfather bowling with the angels. Remember, he loved bowling. I think that was a strike, right? Hopefully he'll get another one. And right after that, suddenly, now that he understands what's going on, this kid can get out from under the table and function again. In fact, now that thunder and lightning, well, that means that Grandpa's getting a strike. And so Jimmy can barely wait for the next one. So here he went from a fearful breakdown to curious fascination. This is what good answers do. They ground us. So with that being the case, we're going to go ahead and check out a new kind of good answer. How about some scientific answers? You see, scientists, they're part of a long tradition of humans seeking answers about our world and our origins. And let's jump into that line right now. Let's get some perspective from the philosopher Auguste Comte, because he already did exactly what we're doing today. He examined, well, how people have answered the big human questions over time. And helpful to us, he spelled out an evolutionary schema to explain how humanity went from being frightened children under the table, well, to the scientific knowledge producers that we are today. Comte, his schema, it goes under the name of positivism, right? And positivism identifies three main stages in the human quest for truth. There's the theological phase, the metaphysical phase, and of course last, the positive phase. So, in the frightening early phase of human development, when we're under the table, we associate the unknown exclusively with unpredictable supernatural forces like, well, the gods of ancient Greece, Why are we suffering from drought? Did we offend Zeus? You see, blaming him, well, or someone else in the pantheon, that mollifies us because we have an explanation for what's going on. And the human mind, as we've talked about already, it needs these explanations. It craves them. So eventually, right, humankind transitions into, well, another phase on the road to scientific knowledge, right, that middle phase. And it's Aristotle who's going to provide our great example of this one. Thinkers like Aristotle, they used reason and observation to sharpen their understanding of the world. When he looked at the natural world we live in, he saw a dynamic planet of constant change, but it was nestled in this perfect universe, right in the center of a perfect universe. And like let's call it a simplified periodic table, he theorized that the universe consists of three different types of substances. One, first, there's this earthly matter, and that can be both seen and felt, right, like you and me. But then there's celestial matter, right? Now that can be seen, like when we look into the stars, but you're not going to feel that. Last, there's the spirit matter, and that can't be seen and it can't be felt. It was this explanation of the universe that Aristotle used, and this explanation traveled widely, right? It went from Thomas Aquinas in the Christian tradition to Averroes and Maimonides of the Muslim and Jewish traditions, respectively. And all of these influential thinkers, they incorporated Aristotle's explanation of the cosmos. Why? Well, quite simply, it placed the earth at the center, surrounded by the heavens, and you know what? That earth required a prime mover or a deity. So Aristotle's ideas, right, his ideas about the universe, they held strong well into the Middle Ages. And the reason, it's because they aligned so well with the existing religious explanations of the universe. So why would humanity move on from the comfort of their Aristotelian model of the universe? Well, the more people thought, and when they sort of considered this idea, the more they started testing and correcting what we were thinking. And it was people like Galileo who picked up instruments like telescopes, and they eventually determined that our Earth, well, it couldn't possibly be at the center of our universe. But there was another critical invention that inspired people like Galileo to test and correct our knowledge of the universe. Maybe you can guess what it was that ushered us into Comte's third phase, that positive phase. And if you need a hint, think about mid-1500s in Europe, right? Because, well, that's when Johannes Gutenberg built a printing press that, unlike the wood and ceramic print blocks that preceded it, made viable the mass production of books, of knowledge. And so think about this. Amazingly, without cars, trains, or factories, this Gutenberg press, it spread across Europe in half a century. And a faster and cheaper way of making books meant that humans had progressively more books and more access to information, both religious and otherwise. And these books and our collective human library, well, eventually that will seed a revolutionary string of scientific pioneers from Copernicus and Herschel and Newton to Darwin, Mendel, and Crick, right? And so the collective work of the early methodologists like Newton, they established a new way to explore our universe and ourselves. So now, through the scientific method, we can test and correct each other's ideas to produce knowledge that, by design, evolves. Now, take Darwin, for example. Sure, he was on to something major with natural selection, but as we'll discuss in a moment, he was completely off with his explanation for heredity, right? I mean, other scientists, they tested and corrected Darwin's ideas to improve and refine our collective understanding about the scientific answer to the foundational anthropological question, who are we and where do we come from, right? And instead of a story about humans coming to North America on a Pacific rainbow, Scientists, well, they tell a new story to explain our origin. And in a word, their story is the story of evolution. And as we'll soon see, anthropology as an interdisciplinary science, well, it's uniquely anchored to this concept evolution. Now, it took millennia for humans to collectively work out science and the idea of biological evolution. But for most of our existence, the majority of us sided with Aristotle. And the answer was essentialism. We, like all living things, well, we've always existed the way we exist today, right? The exact opposite of evolution. This is called stasis. Now, we can imagine why early religious figures like Aquinas, why they accepted Aristotle's essentialism and even promoted it. It's because it aligned with literal interpretations of the biblical creation. So it was thinkers like Galileo, right? They certainly understood prevailing theories about our universe, but when ideas in their heads didn't match up with what they saw with their own eyes, that cognitive dissonance, that's what's going to precipitate the rise of science. No matter how many times he read that the Earth was at the center of the universe, Galileo, he just couldn't help recognize the evidence. We're spinning around the sun, not vice versa, right? Galileo, he didn't understand everything about our place in the universe, but he challenged us to continue looking and to continue refining what we know, test and correct. So, rather than looking up to the stars with Galileo, it's our anthropological elder, Charles Darwin, who turned his sights from planets to people. And what he noticed is that we're related to every living organism. Think about that. Every living organism. Actually, he's not the first one to come up with this idea. You know, it was, oddly enough, his grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. He wrote this book called Zoonomia. It was about 60 years before Darwin's On the Origins of Species, right? And the ideas in this text, well, they're going to sound quite familiar to those of you who've read Origin of Species. Namely, all living organisms share a common ancestor. And as a proto-anthropologist, Erasmus Darwin, well, he relied on comparative anatomy, paleontology, and even embryology because he was testing theories on how species, including our own, emerge. But remarkably, Erasmus Darwin, he even wrote poetry to express this idea. Bear with me for a second, and let's hear a few lines from his 1802 poem, The Temple of Nature. Organic life beneath the shoreless waves was born and nursed in ocean's pearly caves. First forms minute, unseen by spheric glass. They move on the mud or pierce the watery mass. These, as successive generations bloom, new powers acquire and larger limbs assume, whence countless groups of vegetation spring and breathing realms of fin, feet, and wing. I mean, just before the elder Darwin started writing these poems in his books, there's another guy, a naturalist named Carl Linnaeus, and he began publishing Systema Naturae in 1735. And it was in this multi-volume classic from the history of science where Linnaeus classified any living thing he could set his eyes on, right? I mean, in essence, what he's doing is he's giving us our very, very first comprehensive family tree of all living organisms. But wait, there's one question that challenged Erasmus Darwin and Linnaeus alike, and that was, how do these species really emerge? What's going on here? Well, you see, they could see and classify the planet's biological diversity, but they really weren't clear on the actual mechanisms of evolution. So, in the testable and correctable tradition of science, it's Charles Darwin who picks up the mantle, right? And he continues the efforts of his grandfather. And as the famous story goes, he worked out the answer to his grandfather's question while sailing around the world on the HMS Beagle. You see, Darwin, he explained the mechanism of evolution, that thing that drives evolution. It's natural selection. Specifically, what did he mean? Well, he says organisms change gradually over time. And as a result, sometimes new species emerge and sometimes they die out. So Darwin said it's natural selection that's going to make this possible. And in order for us to sort of grapple with what he's thinking about, let's break it down into 4 pieces. First, As we can plainly see with our own eyes, there's variation in traits. Imagine, for example, we're staring deep into the blue Caribbean water, right? And there, right there on the sandy floor, we can see hundreds of starfish. There's a lot of red ones, there's some pinkish ones. And you know what, though? The pinkish ones you can barely see because they're blending so well into that beautiful sand. That's step one. These starfish, all of them, one species. But as we see, there's two different traits. There's the pink and there's the red. Let's move on to part two. Not all of these starfish will be equally successful at reproducing. You know, some of the starfish, they're not even going to reproduce at all. And it's this that he calls differential reproduction, right? So building on our Caribbean metaphor, think about this. You know, sea creatures like manta rays and a few types of sharks, they absolutely love eating up starfish. And because they can easily spot the red ones, it's the red ones that tend to get eaten, unlike their camouflage counterpart. So, as a result, fewer of these red starfish are going to survive to reproduce. Differential reproduction. All right, let's move to the third piece of natural selection. This is called heredity. Now, go back to the pink starfish. They're going to transmit their pink color to their offspring, as do the red ones, provided that some diver or shark doesn't snatch them up, right? And that brings us to the fourth and final piece of natural selection, right? And that is, in our ocean water example, the pink starfish color, that's what we're going to call an advantageous trait, because it's going to reduce the likelihood of being discovered by a predator. So in the large picture, as time rolls on, the pink starfish is going to become the most common type of these starfish, until eventually it's the sole survivor. So if you have the first three, that would be a variable trait, which is heredity, and if it leads to differential reproduction, bingo, that's it. That is the process of evolution through natural selection, according to Darwin. Now, Darwin's going to publish this answer and even more in his book On the Origin of Species in 1859. And it's this book that really revolutionized how scientists answer our central question, who are we and where do we come from? But let's not forget, unlike the Chumash origin story, Darwin's answer was produced through science. And that means his answers are contingent truths, right? They're contingent truths that we're supposed to test and correct. And that's exactly what people did. And one of the earliest revisions of Darwin's ideas came from a monk, Gregor Mendel. He was a monk living in what is now the Czech Republic. And you see, as part of his evolutionary ideas, Darwin theorized that heredity operates through blending, right? Blending. It's like mixing paint. You pour some white paint with some red paint, what are you going to get? It's pink paint, right? Darwin said that's what happens with us. We're born as a blended version of mom and dad. However, what Mendel discovered was that when parents produce offspring, maybe a better hereditary metaphor might be M&M candies. I mean, think about this. When your mom contributes a bunch of yellow M&Ms and your dad contributes a bunch of blue ones, you mix it all up in a bowl, you don't get green M&Ms, right? And so, like most farmers, Mendel and a lot of others, they knew about crossbreeding plants to produce highly desirable traits like maybe high yield. So Mendel, he planted tens of thousands of these pea plants at his monastery because he was going to test how traits pass from parent to offspring. And he observed 7 key traits of his plants. He watched how traits like pod color were expressed in, well, only one of 2 ways. They're either going to be yellow or they're going to be green. Nothing in between. So, like a sports fan, right, keeping stats on a team, Mendel notices that, hey, only 1 of 4 of these plants are having yellow pods. And then he noted the same ratio was happening with other traits, like, say, seed shape and height, right? What he's discovering here is dominant and recessive genes, right? A yellow pod is going to be rare. Why? Well, it's because it only can emerge when both parents contribute a recessive gene for pod color. Any other combination, that's going to produce green. Mendel wasn't the only person testing and correcting and improving our understanding of evolution. Just as Mendel helped tighten the screws with regards to heredity, fellow scientists continued to refine our knowledge of evolution and of our biological origins. Hugo de Vries, he helped us begin to imagine and test ideas about mutations. Meanwhile, Francis Crick and James Watson, eventually they're going to reveal to us the structure of DNA. And with that, we've mapped out the entire human genome. So by remaining open to new and progressively better explanations about our origins, scientists, they've completely built a much more comprehensive explanation for how evolution works. From Darwin's days on, the theory of evolution was an efficient and compelling way for us to understand who we are and where we come from. And in fact, it didn't take long for people to metaphorically apply this idea of evolution outside of the biological world. You know, influenced by Darwin's ideas, it was scholars like Herbert Spencer and William H. McGee who ushered in social Darwinism, which asserts that just as biological organisms evolve from simple single-cell organisms to complex things like, well, humans, giraffes, penguins, social systems, they do the same thing, right? Social systems and culture, well, they travel the trajectory from simple to complex societies, sociocultural evolution. So, in the late 19th century, social Darwinism, it ruled the day because it was considered a scientific way to explain and justify some serious inconsistencies and inequalities on the planet. Simply enough, people were poor because, they're less evolved. And people lived in houses versus huts because, they're just further along as humans evolve. The arrival of social Darwinist thinking, it emerged with the arrival of the earliest anthropologists. And while other biologists sorted out the rest of the animal kingdom, this new field called anthropology, it tried to make sense of human diversity, both biological and cultural. And it was Harvard's own Frederick Ward Putnam who revealed the new discipline to the American public at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. Now, this fair was branded the Columbian Exposition, and it included an anthropology exhibit, right? Now, the fair, it was a celebration of technology. It was technology in the new scientific age, some 400 years after Christopher Columbus. And visitors, man, they were stunned when they entered this amazing, magnificent building that was aptly titled the White City, right? Now, this White City, it was imposingly beautiful. And it was a massive constellation of exhibition halls displaying the day's newest machines and inventions. It was supposed to be a celebration of modernity, right? What have we achieved these 500 years since Columbus sailed the ocean blue? There was even a pair of marble statues, right? They represented the ideal man and the ideal woman. And the sculptures, they were created based on measurements taken from Harvard and Radcliffe students. You see, Putnam and others, they were imposing that biological model of evolution upon culture and cultural achievements. Today, we consider this idea to be the very definition of ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism in pseudoscience. But back then, these folks, they were essentially arguing that some people are further along on the evolutionary path, both biologically and culturally, than others. Biology and culture, one and the same. And from a distinctively Western perspective, they categorize people on a continuum from savage to barbarian to civilized and, even enlightened. And once visitors got their fill of the enlightened White City, it was time to be presented with a satellite exhibit. A satellite exhibit called the Midway. That's going to be where you and I can, see how the rest of the world lives. I tell you, man, the contrast is going to be stark. Rather than an imposing hall of new technology, the anthropological exhibit, it was a veritable Epcot Center, right, from another era. Putnam, he organized this historic global exhibit as a living museum of what he called primitive people, right? Primitive people who collectively helped visitors see and measure for themselves the progress of modern humanity on display in the White City. He actually got this idea from an exhibition that was earlier in Paris, right? But the early French anthropologists and others, they brought in so-called natives to populate ethnographic village displays of the people who lived in the French colonies of Africa and Asia. So by the time the fair finally opened, the Midway, I tell you what, it was a hit. I mean, if you came in through the entrance, right, it's just off Washington Park there in Chicago, you were instantly transported to another world. It was sights, sounds, smells, tastes, right? There's the Brazilian music hall pumping out South African rhythms, and an ostrich pen and the Chinese theater and the exotic souvenirs and the Indian bazaar. I mean, you'll have a blast visiting those people in the model villages tucked in, well, every single corner. I mean, you've got the Javanese, you've got the Dahomey, the Irish, the Pacific Islanders. There's even a brilliant recreation of a street in Cairo. Now, you can imagine that in a world that would have to wait another century for the internet and YouTube, visitors were absolutely smitten with this remarkable display of humanity. And I tell you, they were. Visitors, they flocked. They flocked to gaze at these exotic peoples and lives from across the world, buying up new foods, souvenirs, and enjoying amusements like a Ferris wheel all along the way. And that really pleased the fair organizers because this whole Midway thing, it was designed as a moneymaker. People and artifacts from around the world, they gave visitors a window into the broader world from which to measure modernity, right? The modernity of the white city. So from Turkey and colonial India to Native America and Africa, there was a stark difference, right? And an intentional contrast between the white city and everything else. So here are some of the earliest anthropologists teaching people, right, the general public, that much of the world's population, it's slightly less civilized and ultimately less human. Now, this type of thinking was embraced by those who then could justify disastrous inequalities like colonization, manifest destiny, right? These were moral burdens. So rather than understanding colonization and the Atlantic slave trade as evil-rooted violence, whites of European extraction, well, they had a moral duty to extend their colonial reach, no matter what the human cost. It was part of a mission to, quote, civilize savage peoples, right? They're lagging too far behind on the evolutionary scale, and, well, that's at least what we were thinking. So consider, for example, a young Congolese man named Otabenga. Not only was Otabenga exhibited at a similar exhibit at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904, but he was also on display at the Bronx Zoo in 1906. Think of that. People's views on evolution at the time, it made it possible for the Bronx Zoo to actually house and display a fellow human in the monkey house. Biological determinism and social Darwinist thinking, they were so pervasive at the dawn of the 20th century that its influence even reached into the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court justices, they had something to say about the matter, right? It was 1896, just as anthropology was really truly emerging as an academic discipline. The justices, they consulted the science of the day, including anthropology, and, well, frankly, they upheld racial segregation as constitutional, right? It was the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And that science, that's what we saw afoot at the World's Fair. Technology with a major side order of social Darwinism. So, in line with the day's anthropological theories, Justice Henry Brown, he wrote the majority decision. And he said that so long as one race was inferior to the other, our Constitution is powerless to put them on the same plane. Now you need to note, right, Justice John Marshall Harlan, he gave the dissenting opinion, and he actually said that he saw the upholding of segregation as planting seeds of race hate. But he was clearly in the minority. So just like anthropology, most of the Supreme Court justices use science and prevailing ideas about evolution to defend racial inequalities as natural, right? Segregation, it's inevitable. So this, my friends, this is the nefarious beginnings of anthropology in America. Yikes, right? But wait, don't you give up the ship just yet, because there's a silver lining that we've seen at work throughout this entire lecture, and that's the testable and correctable nature of science, right? The production of truth, yes, but remember, in science, it's always contingent truth. We're always ready to learn more. So, 20th century anthropologists, they continued to test theories about racial difference and human diversity. And it won't be a spoiler to jump ahead, well, a half a century to 1954, when ideas about human evolution and diversity mature to the point that they're going to influence the Supreme Court again, and this time they'll completely reverse their 1896 decision. And, well, this decision in '54 was Brown versus Board of Education. So in future lectures, we'll learn more about the people whose research dismantles social Darwinism. But for now, we've got to return to biological evolution, right, to continue our quest to understand our origins. Next, that quest will take us to the primate family and primatology. We'll see you there.